It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dharmesh Shah to the stage. Welcome, Dharmesh.
Hello, everyone.
So awesome to have you here. As many of you probably know, Dharmesh is the co-founder and CTO of HubSpot. You're probably familiar with Dharmesh and his great work in the Boston and broader startup community. In addition to co-authoring Inbound Marketing, Get Found using Google social media and blogs. Dharmesh founded and writes on onstartups.com, which is an incredible startup blog, and I highly recommend it. It's got a community of over 700,000 members. In 2013, Dharmesh also published HubSpot's Culture Code, which we're going to spend some time talking about today, which is at almost 4 million downloads, I believe, which is incredible. And he was named Inc.'s Founders 40 in 2016. And he's a very active member of the Boston entrepreneurial ecosystem. He's an angel investor in over 80 startups, which we are also going to talk about today. And he's a very frequent speaker on startups, on inbound marketing, and company culture. Now, I think this audience is probably quite familiar with HubSpot and all of its great success, but for those who haven't sort of checked out the latest and greatest, HubSpot is now over, I think, 22 billion in market cap value, having gone public several years ago, and hit an exciting milestone of crossing over $1 billion in annual recurring revenue earlier this year. I think you're at 1.1 billion, if I'm got my numbers great, latest and greatest, but also growing at 41%, which is just amazing over the last quarter. There's over 113 global customers and over 4,000 employees across the world. So a lot of exciting things and several other accolades, which we'll dive into more specifically. But Dharmesh, thank you so much for joining us today. There's so many great topics to cover. We're going to talk about Boston. We'll talk about culture. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the industry, angel investing, leadership. So hopefully you're ready and excited to dive in with us.
I am, and just a quick note: it's 113,000 customers. So that
113,000
versus 113. I'm sorry. I don't want to mislead folks. It's like, okay, well, they make a lot of money per customer. We're in the small, medium-sized business space, so.
Sort of the opposite. You're right. I forgot an important word. 113,000 customers. Apologies. Well, good. Well, I'd love to start by putting you on the spot up front, if that's okay.
Sure.
On Twitter, you said I could go deep, so I will. But I've actually heard from friends in your ethos that you actually don't really love doing speaking engagements like this. Is that true? Why is that?
It is true. It's partly because I'm an introvert, like in every aspect of the term. It just takes a lot of energy out of me. I like to do things that I'm good at. It turns out speaking is not one of those things. But it's also an area that I've kind of intentionally spent time on. It's the one thing at HubSpot that I could not delegate. HubSpot has its own conference, and so I got used to the idea that I'm going to have to get up on stage on a relatively regular basis with increasing audience sizes as HubSpot grew. And so it's something I spend a fair amount of time. On a positive note, for all of you introverts out there, speaking is a skill, and like most skills, it's learnable. It's like, oh, I don't have the talent for it. I don't either. All talent is it compresses the time necessary to acquire a skill. It doesn't make anything impossible. It's just that if you are lacking talent or below average in talent, it just is going to take you more work. But since it's a skill, it's still acquirable. I like to think I've acquired some of it now. I'm a little bit better now than I used to be 10, 15 years ago.
Well, I love that insight on talent and time to mastering a skill. I think that's a valuable insight. And so for all the introverts out there, I know there are a lot of them. This is a great testament. Well, given that, we appreciate you taking the time and doing it with us. So thank you. Don't take that lightly. Well, given the name of the event is Boston Reconnect, I'd love to start chatting about Boston to kick it off. You and Brian founded HubSpot in 2016 in Boston. So I was curious, why did you decide to build in Boston? And if you had a mulligan and got to do it again, would you build in Boston again?
So first off, so Brian grew up in the Boston area. I moved here with my wife in '99, and both of us love the Boston area. So that it was a natural thing to do. Having said that, we had choices. We could have done the alternate, which is the kind of Bay Area thing. But A, we love Boston. B, now looking at it in hindsight, if I had a chance to kind of do it over, I would still pick Boston. I'm not saying that because we have a roughly large Boston crew here. But Boston's been good for HubSpot in several ways. The most important of which, the culture of the people here is trying to think the best label to use. They're much more kind of loyal and long-term focus. The Bay Area is great, lots of great talent, lots of great companies, and obviously super successful. But there's a kind of mindset there of changing companies every 2, 3, 4 years. It's just part of the process, which is okay, and it works for them. I get it. But having been in the software industry now for 25 plus years, one thing that I've learned is that in software companies you get increasing compounding returns based on longevity, because you have some senior engineers who can carry large parts of the system in their head. And it's hard to explain, but when you're building new software, if you're adding new features, building new capabilities, your ability to reuse code is one of the defining kind of characteristics of how well you're going to do. And the only way you can know not to rewrite this thing, and that we've already done that before, is to have some sense or some history in your head, or actually even the code in your head, to say, oh, I know we did that already. That's probably the right way to do it. Let's pull that off the shelf or something like that, and make more kind of deliberate, thoughtful trade-off decisions. And so, and that's not just for engineering. I think over time, there's this kind of institutional knowledge that builds up that often you sort of lose if the churn is too high. And good for us that way. And talent Boston has amazing talent density. We have, I think, per capita, like the largest number of educational institutions, in a kind of 5 square mile radius than anywhere. So that's another benefit. And I like Boston because it's, so the issue with the Bay Area, partly for me, because I'm lazy, is that the Bay Area is bimodal. And what I mean by that, there are some number of companies down in the valley, down in Palo Alto. And if that's your thing, you do it. If you're going to be doing a startup and there's nothing else to do down there, not really. And then there's San Francisco, which increasing number of venture capitalists and founders are moving to. But the issue is, like, the commute time between the two is erratic, and you constantly find like you're in the wrong place. It's like, I'm living in Palo Alto, but this thing that I want to do is in San Francisco, or vice versa. And the nice thing about Boston is you can literally, if you had to, walk to just about anything that's going on that you'd want to go to as a founder. So I like that.
Very.
I would never walk to places. That's not my thing.
But you could.
But I could. That's
that's the part. Well, having done that SFA Menlo commute, I agree. You lose a lot of time. But what about you? You've also shared that Boston tech ecosystem should be bigger than it is. Why is that? What do you think Boston needs to realize more of its full potential?
Yeah, a couple of things. I've been in the Boston startup scene here for, since 99, whatever the math works out to, 12 years. No, more than that, 2 years. Wow, time flies. And I've seen cycles. I've seen up and down cycles in the startup community overall. I think what's happened here is we have a disproportionately lower number of high beta startups, given like the level of talent that we have here, right? We have lots of smart people coming in to get their degrees, and too many of them, even though they've seen Boston, they've been here for school to one of our great institutions, but then they go back out again to wherever they came from or wherever they think a startup should be started. And I think that's partly a function of capital. That's my thanks to Underscore and folks like you that are kind of energizing the Boston community with more early stage capital for kind of better high beta risk. We've been reasonably good at like low beta companies, things that we know are going to succeed, enterprise software and stuff that's relatively kind of tried and true and proven. I'd like to see more kind of consumer startups, more early stage. I think we deserve it. I think we're going to see an upswing. I think we're going to go through another cycle. One of the other advantages Boston has going for it, it's a diverse set of companies and industries here. We've got healthcare, just life sciences generally. So that's great. We've got actually a roughly decent kind of financial services sector here in Boston. So my hope is that we'll see an increased pace of startup activity over the next 5 years or so.
Well, we certainly hope so, and that's part of our thesis here at Underscore, and a lot of the folks on the event today are either some of those early founders or folks who are helping those founders grow. So I think we believe in that vision, and things like this hopefully can be a part of that. And I know a lot of your work in the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem has helped fuel that as well.
Yeah. By the way, I noticed Joe Caruso is one of our attendees. I was just going through the list as I was waiting backstage in the room. He was one of our earliest angel investors. So he was supported by FIDO and a strong supporter of the Boston tech ecosystem. So those are the kind of folks we need.
Really awesome. Well, Joe has been a wonderful contributor to the broader Boston ecosystem and to the core community here. So I love that call out, and smart man to get to be one of your early investors.
Only he invested at what ended up being, since it was a $5 million valuation discounted back, I think. So his effective valuation was $4 million versus the $22 billion. Of course, we've diluted it on the way here. The textbook case, actually, HubSpot is. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's a smart investment.
Good return.
And speaking of sort of the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem, a thing I'm interested in is Mafia Companies. We talk about this in venture world, and PayPal sort of a classic example, and HubSpot is now pretty established as what we call a Mafia company. And for those who don't know the reference, it's when early employees of companies go off to spin out their own companies, and so it's become a bit of a system. There's great companies like Drift and Insight Squared, AppQs, Lola, Wonderman is one that we're proud to back. All have been founded by early HubSpot folks. And it's interesting because some founders and leaders actually deliberately don't want that to happen. They want people just focused on what they're building here at this company and want to keep people focused on that. But I'm curious, what's your take on this? Was this intentional, and how has this sort of played into your hiring?
It was intentional, and I too fall into that camp. That if I could wave a magic wand and get people to stay, the best people to stay forever, I would totally do that. I'm very self-serving that way. But one thing we recognize is that pragmatically, if we are looking to hire, which I think most founders are, hire onto the team people that are entrepreneurially minded and creative and have that energy that like you need in a startup in its early stages. If you're going to recruit those kind of people, you have to be prepared for the fact that they're not going to work for you forever, that they're going to want to likely someday start something on their own. So in all the kind of recruiting meetings that I've done, that's kind of been part of the pitch, and it's true, which is, if you have a startup idea that that's kind of burning a hole in your head, you should go do it, right? Like, we are completely supportive. Let us know if we can help. We'll look at investor decks and pitch decks and things like that. Great. If you're entrepreneurial, but you don't yet have an idea that you think is like good enough for you to kind of devote your time to, spend some time at HubSpot. It'll be the equivalent of a startup MBA. You'll meet lots of cool people. You'll learn some things. You'll get exposed to a bunch of stuff that we're learning as we scale. And your odds of success will go up when you do start your startup. So, and that works well and has borne out to be true. Part of our kind of pitch is we don't want to just build a great company in the Boston area. We want to build great entrepreneurs. And we did intentionally do that in terms of those that were coming up. And we knew there were folks that were going to go off and do startups someday. We enjoy them while they're there. They contribute immense amount of value when they're there. But and we stay friends. We invest in a lot of them. I personally invest in a lot of them. But it's worked out well. Yeah.
Well, it's a very open-minded and forward-looking view, which I think we need more and more of. So looking forward to more of the HubSpot Mafia and future ones as well, sort of the next gen.
Yeah.
So this brings me a little bit to culture. You're starting to talk about it a bit, and I'm very excited for this topic. I know it's one you're passionate about. And before we dive into it, it's my understanding that you will try to use software to solve almost any problem. And is it true that you wrote a name generator to name your son Sohan?
It is true that I have a child. I know my wife and I agreed that the number of children was going to be n less than equal to 1. It turned out to be 1. And when I needed to come up with a name, I'll give you the short version of it, right? So, and we wanted something that was short. So if you look at all the possible names, if you look at it just as a kind of permutation problem, it's like, okay, we want 5 letters or less because we think it's better marketing. Short name's better because it'll be truncated otherwise anyway, but if it's short enough, people won't truncate it as he gets older.
Right.
So things like that. But the big breakout, this is the thing I'm most proud of. And so I would do, it's like, and there are certain letters, and I would run samples by my wife, and she would say, I don't like these 3. I'm like, well, why don't you like those 3? It's like, that combination of letters is a little harsh or whatever. It sounds too harsh or some adjective thereof. And I didn't need to understand it. So then I would update the algorithm and remove all permutations that have that combination of letters. The net result, though, is we had a candidate list, and the list wasn't shrinking fast enough. And then the thing we realized is we didn't want a unique name, because a unique name is just so odd that people are just not used to it, right? Like, I don't want him to be the first X, and we didn't name him X, but his name is Sohan. And so the breakthrough was like, we'll run it against the Facebook Graph API, because if that name has been used ever, someone has taken that username on Facebook. That's just a given. And it was easy enough, at least in those days, in the Facebook days, to be able to just ping the Facebook Graph API and just see if that name exists. Anyway, but yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Use the algorithm to generate my son's name. My wife is happy with it. My son is happy with it. It worked out all right.
Clearly something worked, and it's my understanding that you maybe took a somewhat related or framework approach to building the culture at HubSpot. So, having looked at some of the work that you've done, I mean, the culture code document is amazing. So for those who haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. I've read all 128 slides of it. And clearly you're doing something right because, back in 2021, not back in 2021, HubSpot was voted number 4 best place to work, which is an incredible accomplishment, something to be really proud of. And also in 2020, it was voted best large company for women to work for, which I think is also something to be very proud of, particularly in this industry. So clearly the work that you're doing is paying off and doing something very right. I also think it's interesting in sort of my research in this is that, you were deemed sort of the definer and keeper of HubSpot's culture. And there's a lot of reasons why this is interesting. I think as an introvert, that's interesting. And also it's my understanding that you don't have direct reports. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
So it's sort of an interesting role for you. So I'm curious, how did you become responsible for this? And can you tell us about how you approached defining HubSpot's culture in the early days?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a short version of the backstory, which is, Brian, my co-founder, who's CEO of HubSpot, came back from one of these CEO group meetings that he went to regularly on a quarterly basis where he talked, and I always envisioned them sitting in a circle and singing CEO songs somewhere. But anyway, he came back from one of these, and the theme that day happened to be culture. And Brian's kind of take at that time was, oh well, culture is something we'll kind of work on as we get bigger, but right now we're so early stage, we're focused on building the product and selling the product and growing and doing all the things that a startup has to do. And his CEO group came down on him pretty hard. It's like, Brian, you don't get it. Like, there is nothing more important than culture. If you don't get that right, like nothing else will matter over the long haul. So he kind of took that, and we had one of our founders dinners, which are 3 to 5 hour affairs involving alcohol, and he shared this with me. He's like, oh, I just had my CEO group thing. I'm like, oh, cool. What'd you learn? And he's like, well, this culture thing is evidently really important. I'm like, great, very important. It's like, Dharmesh, why don't you go do that? I think I'm paraphrasing, but that was the exact term. Why don't you go do that? I'm like, I have no idea what that means. And like, of all the people at HubSpot to choose to work on like these people issues, why pick the one that like least likes being around people, right? It seems like an orthodox choice. But I'm like, okay, fine. He had the CEO job. He was doing a ton of things. It's like, I'll kind of carry my weight. And I treated it like I always do. I treated it like an engineering project. It's like, okay, well, we have to have some sort of culture, whatever it is. All I need to do is kind of document. Things seem to go really well. And I started with a survey, which asked the kind of standard NPS question, on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend HubSpot as a place to work? And then the why, the qualitative question. Couple of things I learned here. Like, as soon as I shared with the team at the time, the fact that I was kind of working on culture and thinking about culture, I had, up until that point, probably even until now, the most negative visceral reaction from the team that I've ever had in my professional career, let alone HubSpot. People, he said things like, oh, so we're going to do this culture thing now. And then it's going to be like, mission statements on the wall, and we're going to become like one of those companies. And then the thing that really got me was when one of the team members, who, by the way, I had hired all these people, right? These were not some random strangers that didn't know who I was, or what I was about. It's like, Dharmesh, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't think HubSpot's the kind of company I thought I joined. It's like, you're killing me here. It's like, why such a deep, negative, visceral reaction? I was not expecting this, right? And it turns out people, when they think about culture, they think about this weird thing that big companies do to kind of impose platitudes, and it's just the classic, like, that's how it is. And in the startup world, and there's also this thinking, oh, it should be organic. Just the fact that we're talking about it makes it unauthentic, and all this. There was a lot of stuff packed into it. But once we got over that, it got a lot better, a lot quicker. So the version 1 of the culture code deck was 16 slides. And it answered one question, which is, and the question I asked myself is like, okay, if I were to write a mathematical function or a computer science programming function to approximate the probability of success of any given HubSpotter, what are the coefficients of the things that are passed in? What are the parameters to that function, right? We might not know the weights or the relative, but what things would go in there? And I'm trying to like kind of boil it down to that. So what are the attributes, so to speak, of not good people, but people that are likely to succeed at HubSpot, which sometimes are different questions. But I was looking at like who's likely to succeed. That was kind of a probabilistic model. And we came back with a set of attributes that were highly correlated with what we consider to be the best, most successful, best fit people at HubSpot. And things like humility came out, things like transparency came out. So that's where the original kind of core values of HubSpot emerged. And it was interesting. So I published that deck internally only. And then the team came back, I think it was probably a couple of years later. It's like, Dharmesh, that's been useful. Like that, it's so they conceded the fact that maybe I wasn't here to come up. But they're like, okay, well, it doesn't really go. It tells us the who. It doesn't really tell us how to make decisions or how to make trade-offs or do these things. And so that's when I started working on what is now the definitive culture code deck, which has been 128 slides since its inception. That new V2. So my apologies to all those that had to go through that. But it's been interesting. So I thought of it as like, if I had now, it's like, okay, it's not simply a matter of a single function. If I were writing an operating system on which we could run HubSpot that would help us make these kind of heuristic decisions on how people make decisions, what would that look like? And so when people see the term culture code, they often think code means like a code of conduct or code of moral ethics. I was actually thinking code, like culture code, like actual Python code. As it turns out, that's not possible since humans are very unpredictable. But anyway, so the document's done really well in terms of just articulating HubSpot's culture. One big lesson we learned is that it was useful to obviously have as an internal document. Releasing it to the world, which we give a hat tip to Netflix for, which did that, has been immensely helpful. And I would recommend all founders, you don't have to write a 128 slide deck, but you should be working more on culture than you likely are right now, at least amongst the founding team and the early team. Get a sense for what kind of company you're trying to become, what kinds of people will tend to do well there, and share that, especially with candidates, right? If you want them to self-select in and self-select out, right? So it should be this kind of document that helps you separate like the people that are going to be happy versus those that are probably not going to be happy at your company. And there's no perfect right or wrong answer. So this is who we are. If this feels like the place you would enjoy, then you should come look at us. If it doesn't, no harm, no foul. It's great. Anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but that's something out of
No, I love it. I think it's such a fascinating story. I love the reference of code and the path to design it, and then I think also the act of iterating it as you evolve is very valuable. And to your point, I think a lot of founders don't necessarily think about it early enough or don't quite know how to approach it.
Yeah.
So I think you just
as far as insights, sorry to interrupt, but
no.
I have bad short-term memory. So my one piece of advice, this is a big kind of insight that I've had personally working on this now, and it kind of fits, is that you should think of culture as a product, like literally a product, and the people that work in the company, your team, are the customers of that product. So as you're thinking about, if you think about it that way, a bunch of stuff starts to make sense. Like number one, you would never build a product without asking the customers what it is they're looking for from that product, number one.
Right.
Number two, you would never build a product and not see if customers were happy with the product or not by surveys or usage or however you measure it. You would never build a product and say, oh, well, that was fun. I'm done with that product now. No product is ever done. So, like one of the mistakes people make is like, oh, we've got this culture. Now our job is to preserve this culture for eternity for as long as we can. Nope. Just like a product, it needs to iterate, it needs to fit whatever the use cases are at a particular point in the company's evolution. So the idea is not to protect and preserve the culture. The idea is to optimize the culture as you go so it continues to serve as a well-functioning operating system or a set of heuristics, whatever you want to kind of think of it as. But that metaphor holds remarkably well. Every time I poked and prodded at it, it's like, oh, is it really? Yes. And now if you look at it, it's like some of the things we've had happen over the last year or 2 years, global pandemic, social justice issues. It helps you answer a bunch of questions, which is, okay, well, as it turns out, like, oh, should we be a remote company? Should we be a hybrid company? What should we be? Part of the answer should be asking your customers, because that's a part of culture. And it might be that you have one of those companies that everybody wants to be remote. Everybody was miserable having to come into the office anyway. You don't know until you survey. And just like a product, you wouldn't always do exactly what the customer said, right? Like you're solving for the long-term interest of theirs as well. But you should at least listen. You don't have to follow the direction, but you should at least listen to the advice and listen to the feedback. And so one of the things we've learned is that on the list of features, which has been relatively stable for a long time, is the flexibility feature in terms of feature requests has gone up, which is not surprising. It's not counterintuitive at all. It's very intuitive, that's one of the top features people are looking for in a company culture is like, I'm taking care of elder parents, or I have kids, or I have this, it's like, if you can give them flexibility, that will often trump trump titles in terms of, I'd rather be a senior director at a company that gives me the flexibility than a VP somewhere else, right? It's like people actually do these kind of calculations, analyses in their head, and they favor features. If I haven't done a conjoint analysis yet, but if I did, I think it would probably pop up as being one of the key ones.
I love that, thinking of it as a feature, and also the product framing. And I'm looking at the chat. I think it's really resonating with people as they think about this. And I do think people are curious about sort of the new normal and future state. I read that something that you wrote back actually in 2019, the pajama principle: success is proportional to the degree to which you let people stay in their pajamas. And if I look at your 2020, I think that's probably quite true. So I think that the flexibility is something that really resonates with folks, and as they're thinking about what's ahead, I think that's an important one for people to think about and internalize. If you're open to it, I'm sure we could talk about this topic for hours, but I'd love to shift gears a little bit just to make sure we can cover some things. And also I'm going to give folks a chance to ask questions. So people are already starting to put stuff in the chat, which is great. We'll get to those in just a few minutes. But I'd love to talk a little bit about what's going on in the industry and what you guys are seeing. And I think, particularly the past year has seen shifts in two areas that I know greatly impact HubSpot. One is the world of digital transformation, sort of looking at different businesses, recognizing the need to digitize all different parts of their business, which certainly applies to sales, marketing, and success. And I think particularly on the SMB side. And then the other big shift that we've seen a lot is just the double down emphasis on customer experience and what we've called over the past year sort of hugging your customer. Particularly in the past year, retention was so important, and making, keeping up with customer expectations has been so key. So I'm curious, at HubSpot, what have you done in response to these shifts? And also, can you share how you expect some of these shifts to play out?
Yeah, so number one, and this, I think we're a little bit uniquely suited to, since that's the product, is helping businesses deliver this kind of transformed digital experience to their customers. But the thing, the shift we've seen right now, and this is, so the shift that HubSpot was founded on was this notion that marketing had changed and that the outbound model just didn't work. You couldn't spam people and cold call them that effectively anymore as you once could. The shift that we're seeing now is that the expectations from customers, including in B2B, have just risen, right? So we're used to being able to, back when we did those things, like call an Uber and a car shows up, and and they're looking for that level of convenience and digitization from, over time, every company they do business with, right? Whether it's scheduling an appointment, whether it's following up on a support ticket, and so showing up on some company's website and saying, oh, please call us back between at normal business hours from 9 to 5, like normal for who, right? Like that's, right. And it just seems like it's like a relic of the past. Right now, some industries will trail others, but the kind of universal truth is that all customers everywhere, all consumers, all people will want a more convenient experience that caters to their needs, not the systems that whatever vendor happened to have at the time or whatever sales process they happen to design at the time. We don't care about that. If you look at our own individual behavior, it's like, I don't care if the fact that customer success is a different department from customer support or whatever. I want to be able to email someone and say, here's the issue that I'm having, and an email and a screenshot, and be able to get some semblance of an answer, or at least give me a fighting chance at finding the answer on your website somehow. That kind of thing. That
expectation is certainly settled in, yes.
And as happy as I am with HubSpot, and the fact that my advice to folks that are looking for ideas, looking for opportunities, this game is like in the early innings, right? It's like, yep, HubSpot's been reasonably successful so far, but lots more opportunity. The water's warm. Then we can talk about SMB as well, because I think the opportunity in SMB that intersected with, let's say, customer stuff, but even just SMB in general, is much higher now. The venture capital community is much more open to it because there's more precedence now of success. Like back when HubSpot started, one of the hardest things about growing HubSpot was people didn't believe, venture capitalists didn't believe that you could actually build a big business in SMB. That was just too hard, a software business, because there weren't a whole lot of precedents, like Intuit, software company in the SMB space. And then it starts to get hard back, in 2005, 2006 timeframe. So, but now we have Shopify, we have, some degree HubSpot, and a bunch of others that have built successful, sustainable, great businesses in SMB, or at least focused on SMB.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a lot we could talk about sort of in that. I mean, here you are at $1 billion with an ACV of what, about 10,000 per customer? I mean, that's incredible. And so I think you've certainly been a part of paving the path in the world of opportunity around SMB.
By the way, just a more fun life in SMB, just so you know. I grew up in enterprise software, which is fine. And one of the reasons Brian and I started the company is that we had both grown up in enterprise software, and we both had experienced how non-fun it is to have super long sales cycles. You have this lumpiness at the end of the quarter, and then a big customer has so much control over the roadmap because they're paying you millions of dollars a year or something like that. It's like you don't have all that in SMB. And in the consumer market, you have bimodal businesses. Like, I'm going to be the next Facebook. It's going to be worth $100 billion, or it's going to be nothing at all. It's a very much bimodal outcomes often in consumer space. SMB is like you can charge money for solving problems the old-fashioned way, but there's enough scale for it to look like a consumer business where you don't have revenue concentration. You can have short sales cycles and things like that. So we're kind of really happy with that choice and plan to stick to it.
Well, it's also very impressive. I think often, and maybe it's on the part of VCs, we push go up market, and you guys have stayed so disciplined in that. And I think there's several contrarian pieces of what you guys did. You had a lot of MBAs, you focused on SMB, and you also sort of built a platform from the beginning rather than focusing on one niche thing. So it's, my read of it is you made these bets and you stuck with them, and they've clearly played out.
Yeah, it worked out.
It's very, very impressive. I do, because you are the CTO, I also wanted to talk a little bit about building technical teams and maintaining and scaling technical teams. And you've said that HubSpot's diabolically simple plan for expanding our dev ecosystem is 1, make a platform that is a joy to build on, and 2, be a company that is a joy to work with. That's it. So we've talked a little bit about what it's like to build a company that's a joy to work with, but I'm curious about how you think about building a platform that's a joy to build on. What are some of the processes or rituals of HubSpot's technical teams use to make this happen? Because I know you have a unique approach to that.
And we're still earlier in our evolution, candidly, on the being a joy to work on. We're good, not great. But the HubSpot product, the kind of primary product where carbon-based life forms interact with screens and do things, that product also, in the early years was not great from a usability perspective because it was such a broad offering and we had such few engineers. But now I would put it in the top 3 in every category that HubSpot plays in. And the reason that came to be was a very deliberate investment in user design, user research, just look at the ratios in terms of number of designers to number of engineers. So we've been very, very atypically obsessed with that. And that has worked. And it shows up in the form of customer satisfaction, NPS surveys, and things like that. And I think the way to approach that same problem is you have to think of the developer as a customer. And you have to do exactly all the same things, which is, hey, when we design a product for a customer, we don't say, oh, this is how the database happens to look, and this is the most efficient way for us to build this feature or this screen. It's like, no, if I were a customer or user trying to get this thing done, what's the best way, the most intuitive way, the fastest way, the most efficient way to help them get this thing done? Now, carry that over. For some reason, when we do APIs and do developer platforms, companies often make the mistake. It's like, well, it's a very thin layer of abstraction over whatever the underlying technology happens to be as far as the APIs, right? So it's like, oh, well, we have these things. I'm going to expose those things, those functions via an API so you can invoke it over REST or GraphQL or whatever it is. Right. And that's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is pretend that you're a developer, you're super skeptical, you're on the outside looking in at this thing. It's like, should I build a thing that works with this product? Do I want to build on this platform? And what are the things that you're going to choose? You're going to say, oh, are the APIs modern and clean? Are they cohesive? Do they make sense? Are they comprehensive? Does it let me do the things I want to do? Is there enough documentation there? Are there samples? Can I run a curl command just to test the thing out, like before investing any time or energy? All those things matter. And if you're going to learn, how to do good UX for humans, you look to examples of people that have done this really well. It's often consumer companies, right? They get that really, really right. If you're going to build a developer platform that people find a joy to build on, look at examples like Stripe, look at examples like Twilio, who have made tens of billions of dollars of market cap on creating joyful platforms to build on. So there are lots of precedences. We just need to follow the example. But the simple idea is, the good news is you're a developer for the first time, like you are the customer in some way. So just imagine yourself on the outside looking in, like what would you want in order to build this on? What would actually bring you joy? And I'll close with one thing, which is I'm maniacally obsessed about on both ends, both user stuff and particularly developer platforms, is the time to joy. It's like, okay, I came across this company that has an API and I have some idea in my head that I want to build on this thing. How long from the bit flipping in my brain that says I'm going to do this to the point that it actually makes something work? It doesn't have to be something I can ship and start charging money for, but I get some result back. Like how long is the time? And the issue with lots of platforms is that time is almost like infinity. Like they had never thought of that, right? It's like, oh, wait, this is actually hard. Anyway, that's sorry for the rant, but
no, I think it's very helpful. I think that time to joy is a very succinct message to think about, no matter sort of which part of the stack you're building on, but particularly sort of if you're building for developers. I think that gets underestimated sometimes.
Yep.
I do want to give a chance to bring up some of our Q&A. There's some great questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we have some time. So, Jenny, if you want to help bring up some of the ones that we're hearing. Great. Okay. So, Dharmesh, if you were given a chance to go back in time and build HubSpot again, what would you do differently?
The one thing that jumps to mind, because this is on the list of like top 3 biggest professional mistakes I've made in my career, is I would start working on culture earlier, sooner. So it was several years in before that conversation with Brian happened where we started getting intentional about culture. And part B is recognizing the importance of diversity and building out the early team. Like candidly, that thought had just not even crossed my mind, right? It was it was not a deliberate, oh, we're going to hire people that look just like us, but we ended up hiring people that, everyone pretty much had an MBA. All came out of MIT Sloan, not all, like 8 out of the first 10 hires were MIT Sloan grads, alternating years. And we hired, for lack of a better term, in network out of convenience. And we should have made a more deliberate effort. It's much easier to do that and solve for diversity, and it has long range positive impact, as we're now learning as an industry, as a society, the importance of that. And it's really hard to fix later, right? Once you're at scale, to say, okay, well, now we're going to try and go back and pay off what I think of as culture debt. When you have this homogenous organization where everybody like everybody else, and technology debt, the good news is if you incur technology debt, most of the time you can refactor that piece of code that you took shortcuts on, and you can kind of pay that debt off. It's like, okay, well, I know we took a shortcut, we had to at the time, we needed the product out the door. Culture debt is much more insidious, right? So there's no check you can write, there's no code you can rewrite, because the roots of that are sometimes very deeply planted, right? It's like, then first you have to convince the organization that it's important. Then you have to say, well, what does that mean actually? Like, what do you actually do? And then you have to have the patience to say, okay, well, we spent, a decade not being as mindful of this as we should have been. It's going to take decades, plural, to actually get it to likely where we want it to be. But you have to start the journey anyway. So my piece of advice would be, think about diversity early. It'll be much easier to think about, even though you may not actually get it. At least you plant the seed in your team's head that it's important, right? It's like, oh, we look to hire for diversity. I know the last 2 or 3 weren't as diverse as we would have liked, but otherwise, if you don't even talk about it, then everybody just assumes that doesn't really matter. That's the signal that's being sent when you don't do it. So at least give it effort, give it time, give it consideration.
It's one of the top things that we hear, and I like the framing of culture debt. But you touched on something that's hard, particularly for early stage startups who are trying to go fast. And oftentimes what we've seen is getting that diversity in earlier sometimes can take longer because of the pipeline challenges and things like that.
Yep.
You said just talking about it is a good first step. How do you think startups should think about that trade-off in sort of time versus really investing in this effort? Because it can be challenging.
Yeah. So there's a spectrum here, right? The ideal state is you actually hire for diversity and you do it, right? Whatever time it takes. Next step down is you make attempts at it, and it should be measurable. It's like, okay, well, did we? We have something at HubSpot called the Rooney Rule, where for every every hire, above a certain level, there has to be a diverse candidate that's part of the pool. We had to have at least considered someone. Now, they may or may not have been the right fit. We're not forcing anyone to hire anyone, but so it's like going down the spectrum. So ideally, you try to hire. If not, you at least put the processes in place that make it possible to hire. And yes, it takes an investment. And yes, hiring pipelines are a problem. But at a bare minimum, I'm not saying you should, beat yourself up over it, but you should beat yourself up over it. It's like, okay, we tried. It was 1, it was 2, it was understandable at 3, but we're at 10 people now, and we still have not had a single one.
Right.
Something's not right. I don't think we're trying hard enough. Let's look a little deeper. Maybe make the sacrifice to say the next one will be more deliberate, and we'll take our time with it. Yeah, there's going to be negative trade-offs, but there are definitely negative trade-offs on the other side too. So
yeah, no, I think the articulation of the culture debt is a great way to think about what the negative trade-offs are on the flip side.
Yeah.
Why don't we pull up another question? Oh, we got Joe joining us on stage.
Yeah, sorry, I've got 2 cameras here and it's hooked up to the wrong camera. I'm not trying to go blind here. Hold on, let me see. Never mind. Dharmesh, I'm not trying to avoid you. I just have dual cameres.
No, I know how that is.
Doing, Dharmesh? That's my question.
What's that? I'm sorry?
How is Brian doing?
He's doing well. He's in good spirits. He's healing. We're doing our best as a HubSpot team to make sure he takes the time to heal. You know Brian as well as I do. But we're just giving him the time and the space to heal. But he's in good spirits and is on a path to a full recovery.
Any timing on?
No timing. We're not any big rush. We've got a good deep bench. Company's doing fine. Sometime later this year,
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have a deadline.
Well, say hi to him.
I will.
For me, yeah. He claims that that you guys had to beat me up to get my money when I claim I did it voluntarily.
I'm on your side.
Some ways there's a little bit of an exaggeration.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, thanks for joining us. It's fun to have you, and you're a smart man to have made that first angel investment, and I know you've made many in the broader Boston ecosystem. So thanks for all you're doing in the ecosystem.
Although I have made the mistake of lightening up over time, so I haven't done as well financially as people think. Although I have absolutely zero complaints. Let me put it that way. And my great grandchildren have zero complaints.
Well, that's good to hear. Joe, any other burning? Oh, we lost him. Okay. Well, that was fun to have a cameo from Joe. Great actor in this ecosystem. We have another question. Simon.
Hey, Dharmesh. I miss dinners. This virtual thing is just not good enough. So I want to get your thoughts on, you mentioned access to capital in the Boston area, but, supply and demand for capital are connected, right? To get lots of capital, you got to know how to use lots of capital.
Yep.
Quickly and efficiently to create value. So give me a sense of how you're reading the ecosystem's ability to sort of consume lots of capital, to hyperscale, blitzscale, and what can we do to get better at that skill set?
Yeah, I think one thing I think we need to recognize is, and this is why valuations have been trending upwards. It's easier to build and scale a business than it's likely ever been before, right? We have more efficient access to customers. Marketing is kind of effectively cheaper. We have things like inbound marketing. And so we have to recognize that. The number of industries that still remain to be transformed, and so in terms of moving to the cloud or even moving to SaaS versus on-prem stuff, is still massive. So the opportunities are there. My personal sense on this is that I would like to lead a little bit with capital. I know that's going to sound that, especially in the Boston area, I think we will have enough founding talent with enough companies to be able to deploy more capital than we're deploying right now. And I think part of the challenge has been over the last, I'll say, decade or so, a lot of the kind of flagship firms that were here have been here for a long time. Those venture capital firms have kind of moved. They started by building an office out on the West Coast, and then I could slowly feel the center of gravity move to that office, right? It's like not that they don't have a presence here, not that they don't do deals, but what were kind of preeminently Boston area firms are less so today than they were 10 years ago. But I think being able to access founders and their odds of actually pulling off a success, especially in certain markets that are I'm particularly kind of bound to software, it's a good time to be investing. I've upped my level of angel. I told myself last year that just out of laziness. I'm just going to kind of try and slow it down a little bit. I'm trying to learn piano. I think I did like 8 deals in the last 60 days. I just level of energy in the startup community has been, and now people are much more location agnostic than they used to be. As we see success stories come up all over, it doesn't just have to be the Bay Area. So I think the combination will work well for Boston, which is we have great universities, we'll be able to attract talent, and we can actually make a convincing case that if you are here, you're probably just as good off just staying here instead of trying to move to the West Coast to start your company. You don't have to do that anymore. Maybe there was a time when you should have done that. I don't think it's necessary anymore. Anyway, thanks for your question. That was good chat. Dinner's on me next time we meet.
That was a great one. All right, we have another one. As a public company, how does HubSpot maintain long-term focus with Wall Street focusing on the short-term quarterly results? Question.
That's a great question. One of the things we were worried about, HubSpot has a very strong, deliberate, intentional culture, which we're proud of and we like. One of the core attributes, so I'll tell you a story and then I'll tell you, the story is a good story, and then I'll tell you how we think about it kind of going forward. So when we were going public, one of the things we were worried about was that one of our core values at HubSpot in terms of our cultural attributes that dates back to V1 of the Culture Code deck is transparency. And our rule of thumb is that we share everything with everyone in the company unless it's illegal to do so or unless it's not completely our information to share. And so we were, all the way up until IPO, that has been our thing, right? That's been the heuristic. We share everything with everyone unless it's illegal to do so. And then Brian and I are sitting in a room with legal counsel, investment bankers, and this mix of people that are somewhere in between, I don't know. One of the factors that came up, so we're going down through this checklist of preparing for IPO. And then they say, okay, so we get to this section called the designated insiders list. And they're like, so they're asking me and Brian, it's like, oh, who are the designated insiders? And it's like, oh, so what does that mean? It's like, oh, those are the people that get access to kind of raw financials and stuff. And I think it's Brian's like, oh, so how many people do we need to put on the list? It's like, oh, usually like 6, 8. And then, okay, so 9, 10? And they're like, oh, yeah. And then Brian's like, 12, 15? And so I wish I had this on tape because it was just so much fun. We were on the same wavelength. It's like we were trying to triangulate into what's the actual, and so we come to learn, it took about 5 minutes, that there is no SEC legal requirement as an upper limit in terms of the number of designated insiders. So the decision we made in that room that day was every single HubSpot employee was going to be a designated insider. And it's not an option that they check, do I want to, because there are trade-offs, so you can't trade within certain windows of time and things like that. And then every employee we've hired since, we're at 4,000 plus people now, are all designated insiders. So they still have access to all the information. So that's kind of point number one, which is we don't take for granted that just because we're public means that we have to all of a sudden be a very different company than the company we were. The other thing that we've done that's been very useful is that we don't maniacally obsess over the stock price. The stock price will go up and will go down. And the way I kind of described it as a team is that the stock price will oscillate around the actual value that we're creating for customers in terms of what the business is actually, if there were some margin that could objectively measure the exact valuation for companies, and it drew this particular line, whatever it happens to be, the valuation over the long term, and I'm not the first or last person to say that, but we take that to heart. So we don't obsess as a company over that. We have enough cash on the balance sheet that we're not going to the market, so the valuation any given window of time is not really that relevant. We're not raising, right? And companies cash flow positive. And so we try to run the business as we've always ran it, which is we're solving for the long term. We've always been doing that. We don't look at the kind of vagaries in the market. It's like, oh, they tend to reward growth now more than profitability. And so we're going to adjust the sales, SAILS, no intended. And so that we can kind of solve for growth. And then when it goes the other way, then we're going to, it's like, oh, we don't need as much growth. We're going to solve for profitability. And those things are counterbalancing forces. We're like, here's what makes sense at this point in time for the business. Over the long term, this is what we think is the right thing to do. And that's the thing we do. And we tell the investors exactly what we're doing, including, we talked about SMB. Ever since, HubSpot's going to be 15 years old in 21 days on June 9th.
Wow.
And ever since the company has started, there have been people that's like, okay, well, I know you say SMB and you're starting in SMB, but surely there's a path to the enterprise because that's what everyone does. That's the road to success, right? If you want to build a big, massive, successful company, you're going to, of course, eventually move into the enterprise. And for every quarter for 15 years, Brian and I have reiterated that we have no plans to go to the enterprise and sell to Fortune 1000 companies, that we've kind of figured out how to make, and this is evident now in our ACV numbers, like we still make $10,000. That number doesn't move that much.
Yeah.
It has crossed $1 billion in ARR. So my answer is in this: so if you're founders, let's say you're late stage and you're thinking about going public, the downsides of going public have been overplayed. I will say that. The process of going public is not that painful. Even when we went public, which was 6 years ago, probably even less painful now. There's even other alternatives. And the burden of having investors is not that high. I personally like having real-time valuation of at least what the market thinks. So instead of having a handful of venture community people that might invest in the next round, and based on what time of the month, what time of the day they got up that morning and what side of bed they got up that morning. Here's what the market thinks. They may be right, they may be wrong, but at least we have a sense. I sort of like that, actually. And I just had my first earnings call since Brian's out. It's not like the most joyous activity ever, but it's not that bad.
Wasn't that bad?
Wasn't that bad? They're smart people. I will say this: the analysts and the investors, they ask good questions. They know the company really well, and our approach of just even that transparency. So we give them numbers we use ourselves to run the business. Like, this is what we look at. Here's
the value of the transparency. Yeah.
Have the consistency, and it's like, yep. And when we mess things up, which we do, we'll say, like, here's the thing that we would have done differently next time. This is where we slipped. This is what we're doing about it. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the clock. We're getting close, so I might ask one or two more questions. Here we go. What do you see as the biggest silver lining or opportunity that came out of the pandemic?
Two things. One is, for all companies, we learned a little bit better how to work in a virtual remote world. We built that muscle group. We built that skill set. Some companies didn't think they could do it, and they probably even opposed having people work remotely or be out of the office 1 or 2 days a week. So now we have that skill, which is, or at least tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies now have some semblance of that skill. That's been helpful, and I think that will carry us forward. So some companies may just go back to the traditional way, and that's why I'm not casting aspersions or blame or anything. But some will say, you know what? Maybe like allowing some employees to spend sometimes at home, or declaring Friday, work from home Friday or something like that. They can see it work now. So anyway, so we've kind of planted the seed. People know about that. That's kind of thing number one. Thing number two is, as a society, as an industry, everyone is now it's accelerated the need for digitizing, to need to be more efficient, to need to have systems that will scale with your growth and be able to kind of deliver a customer experience that people are at least desiring, if not demanding now, right? So I think it creates opportunity for us. It lets us get closer to our customers, and it creates opportunity for new startups. I think it's a very vibrant time to start a startup. I never think there's a bad time to start a startup, but there are really good times to start a startup. I think this is one of them. I think we're going to see some. I'm not an economist, but we learned things about remote work, and we're getting closer to our customers, delivering better experiences. That's
yeah. Well, I love that, and with that, I'll ask the last question, if that's okay. Building on your comment, it's a good time to start a company or start a startup. A lot of people in our audience are early in their journey. Some are very, very early. Some are sort of a little further along. But you've shared a lot of great lessons today. There are several various areas, particularly on the culture side is one that sticks with me. But what is one or two things, final thoughts on something that you wish you had known earlier in your journey?
Oh, there's so much things I wish I had known.
There's so many.
Reframing the question is like, okay, if I were sitting in a room with a bunch of entrepreneurs, which I guess I happen to be, or would be entrepreneurs, if you're thinking about doing a startup, here's the thing I'll say. If you're thinking about doing a startup, you're likely kind of early in your career. If you are, you should take the leap. You should take the leap, because here's the biggest mistake most people make, is they overestimate the risk of doing the entrepreneurial thing. And I've talked to thousands, if not hundreds, let's say, of entrepreneurs, successful, not so successful. Not a single one of them, not a single one, even the ones that failed, regretted having taken the leap. It's like, I shouldn't have done that. They may have approached it differently, but they don't regret having taken that shot. People tend to overestimate the risk is because, the reality is that, if you're on this thing right now, you have access to the internet. You have, you're literate. You know things. You have marketable skills. if the thing doesn't work out, so whatever job you have now, I will bet you $1 to a donut, you will have some semblance of that job 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road if things don't work out. I don't mean to be cliched or overly trite, but that's true, right? It's like, oh, it may not be exactly the thing, and maybe you took a half step down the career ladder or whatever. In the grand scheme of things, that is not going to matter. People should not be solving for career ladders anyway. That's a whole other topic. But
I love that. So don't be afraid to take the plunge.
Yep. Find people you enjoy working with, number one. That's the thing. And then the idea, don't even let the absence of an idea hold you back. If you can find someone that you really enjoy working with, the idea you'll sort of figure out. Sometimes the best ideas don't happen until after you start a company.
Interesting. That's me. Well, I think the emphasis on the people side is crucial, and I know that you and Brian have had such an incredible relationship. That could be a whole other talk in and of itself. But this has been just fantastic, and we appreciate so much your insights. We've covered so many different things. I know I took a lot away on the flexibility, the culture debt, the opportunity around SMB in particular, I think is one I'd love to spend hours more digging into, but there's been so much rich learning here. So just on behalf of everyone, particularly the broader Boston community, thank you for all of your leadership. Thank you for spending time with us and for all you've done. And we are so excited to continue to watch the HubSpot rocket. It's been very exciting to see the ride. So Dharmesh, thank you so much for spending time with us. We're very grateful.
Thanks. By the way, folks, if you have follow-up questions, I'm Dharmesh at Twitter. Just tweet me a question. I'll answer it for the rest of the day. So